Greetings, legendary listeners. Welcome to the Marvelous TV Club, your headquarters for the most insightful and entertaining discussions of the latest episode of Marvel television. And that means it's time to talk about the space operatic third episode of Loki, Lamentis. There are a lot of podcasts that talk about Marvel TV, but you know what separates the Marvelous TV Club from the pack. It's the way we organize our approach. Instead of jumbling all of our thoughts together into one shuddering freight train of an episode, we divide our analysis of each Marvel TV episode into 3 distinct shows, each with their own unique lens. Pondervision drops every single Saturday during Loki. That's where Jesse Taylor and I explore the most captivating conundrums of the episode. We tease out their implications for the MCU and for our own reality. On Monday, our character cast with Christine Kippens will get inside the minds of our favorite characters. And in this episode, I gotta be honest, we're gonna spend a lot of time untangling that Loki-Sylvie relationship and how the TVA agents might react to the revelation that they're variants. By the way, Christine not only laid out the theory that the TVA agents are variants last week, but she directly connected it to everything Hunter C20 was saying when they discovered her, that's the agent that Sylvie mind-wiped. We had all that stuff for you last week, so start listening to Character Cast if you aren't already. But as always, we begin our analysis with this show, our Storycast. This is where we break down the latest episode of Marvel TV, not by plot, but by themes, tropes, genres, and archetypes. This is one of the most original TV analysis shows anywhere on the internet, and you can only get it here on the Marvelous TV Club. So in case folks didn't catch this last time, we have merch, we have a new website, the Loki logo, you can get it on a bunch of different stuff. If you want some of that stuff, get it now, because once the Loki series is over, so too will all of those merch options be gone. If you want something that you don't see there, leave it in a 5-star review, and I will do my best to get it up on the site. I'm your multi-hyphenate host, producer, editor, social media maven, and more, Marc Faletti. And as always on Storycast, I'm joined by 2 story experts.
I'm Amanda Marcotte. I am a writer at Salon.com, where I'm covering the American apocalypse as it unfolds.
And I'm Maeve Adams, or Dr. A, as people like to call me on this podcast, where apparently I start apocalypses. No, not really. I teach English literature at Manhattan College, and I run the Digital Arts and Humanities program.
Yeah, we're changing it up this week. Everyone's introducing themselves. Let's see how that goes. I do have a question for you guys before we get into the episode, which is, if Sylvie was in your life and she was going to mind trick you into relaxing somewhere and spilling all of your dirty little secrets, what place in your memories would she take you to? Maeve, where would she take you?
Probably my dinner table, where my friends have gathered because I've made them dinner. It's like one of my favorite places to be on the planet. So yeah, I'm like, I guess, a homebody, as it turns out.
No, that makes a lot of sense, right? Put you at ease in your comfortable place inside your house where all the people that you trust are, and then she'll steal everything that she wants to know.
Yeah. Yep, that makes sense.
What about you, Amanda?
So I think the Dog and Duck in Austin, Texas, circa February 2006.
Puddin'.
That's where our first date was.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, that's good. I like the idea that Sylvie could just impersonate me and get you to spill stuff. Fun fact, Amanda read to me from the Norton Anthology on our first date. There was some poetry involved. It was quite adorable. We were so young then.
English majors are good for something.
That was great shit. Yeah, for me, I think it would probably, if you want me at my rawest and most pliable, it's probably like a major sporting event. I was thinking about the fact that I made that big trip in 2011, Amanda. You might recall this, to the NBA Finals to watch the Dallas Mavericks. I was a big fan of this guy, Dirk Nowitzki, who was on the tail end of his career and finally having a chance to win a title. And I was just like it was a huge, expensive, wild thing I did to go out there. And it was just, you could ask me anything. I was completely vulnerable at that time. So that's probably where I land on that. But more seriously today, we're going to explore 2 primary themes of this episode, one from each of our experts. So we will talk about the moments of the episode that tied into each theme very closely. And we'll also, of course, discuss other works of literature and film that are closely related. So let's begin with you, Maeve. What did you see as the main theme or idea driving this episode?
Speaking of first dates, this episode forces us to reckon with the fact that all the things we think we know about love, right? love is a red, red rose, love is a dagger, turn out to not be particularly helpful when we're in love or beginning to be in love or wanting love. It raises a larger question about what love is.
So what do you mean? Tell me more. Was there a key scene or thread that crystallized this for you?
There's a really poignant scene that is played mostly for comedy, right? When Loki and Sylvie are, sort of traversing this apocalyptic landscape, and they come across like what's basically like an Airstream, like a futuristic Airstream trailer. And that old woman, basically gets the drop on them because, they think they've got it all figured out, and they're going to get the drop on whoever's in there and get, energy for, getting away. And she blasts them away. And Loki's response to this is, he sees a photo of her and her clearly dead husband and morphs into that figure and then presents himself to her. And there's this moment of connection. We cut between the two faces. This is clearly a moment of recognition and affection. And then he says the absolutely wrong thing, which is, "You're as beautiful as ever." And she blasts him away, and we all laugh, and he gets laughed at by Sylvie. And what we kind of realize in this moment is that these two people loved each other, even though they probably didn't say very nice things to each other. So all these kind of expectations we have about what love is supposed to be, how it's supposed to act, how we're supposed to act in romance, get kind of subverted in this moment.
There was a lot in this episode about the idea that love and knowing somebody else truly, or knowing yourself truly, are interconnected. And we see that with that woman. She knew her husband so intimately. She knew that he would never say anything like that. And that is a part of the kind of love that this episode was exploring, I think.
There's another feature of that scene that is, it happens so fast in an instant. I had to pause, rewind, pause so I could see it. The photo that he looks at that gives him the data he needs to Loki to emulate the husband is almost a direct kind of replica of Grant Wood's painting American Gothic.
Oh, sure. That's the farmer and his wife with the pitchfork and all that.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of looking at, the wife is looking at the husband in this kind of like wry or sort of cynical manner. They don't look happy. They look sort of, they look to be without emotion. But what's interesting about the story behind that painting, just very briefly, is that, people see that painting as a kind of a satire of the American Midwest and relationships in the American Midwest. But Grant Wood was attempting to emulate a style of Flemish painting that portrayed couples with each other. And of course, in Flemish painting, much older paintings, Renaissance painting, 17th century, 18th century painting, the portraits that are being made are of very wealthy people whose love is represented in the context of the wealth of these individuals. And, we have a farmer and his wife whose relationship is primarily purposeful, but also very real, very kind of in the moment, right? Two people being captured in their daily lives, not in some representation of them that's supposed to be kind of idealized. It's just reality. It's just what it's like to be a married couple, or not even married, but just a couple in the world having a kind of purpose.
Well, fun fact about that painting, it's not supposed to be a man and his wife. It's supposed to be a man and his daughter.
Well, okay then. So maybe it's not about love. I don't know.
It adds to your point, doesn't it, though? Because you look at it and you have all these assumptions about what the painting's about and the kind of love it depicts. And it's actually a different kind of love. So it's already challenging you on another level to think about love and relationships a little differently than initially on the surface.
Thanks, Amanda. I appreciate you saving me on that one. But yeah, no, actually, you've got a really good point, because there's another feature of the show's meditation on love that has to do with family. Because the other scene that's so crucial there, which is the place where the most obvious place to go for thinking about this, is the scene in the bar between Loki and Sylvie that feels a little bit like a first date, where they're sitting getting to know each other, and and they talk about Loki's and Sylvie's mothers. as a kind of preamble for thinking about what it means to love. So yeah, you've got an excellent point that all the things we kind of expect in that painting, that it must be a husband and wife, it's actually a father and daughter, that these forms of love kind of bleed into each other and complicate one another in really interesting ways.
So I have to ask, because I think everyone is wondering it after watching this episode, were you picking up romantic undertones between Loki and Sylvie?
I mean, that was explicit, right?
Yeah.
It was definitely not explicit. No, explicit would mean they like said it and they didn't.
Well, that's fair. Yeah, it was just super implied.
It's implicit, and it's implicit in a variety of scenes. So we've got the scene that looks like a date. We've also got the scene right before that when they're in the abandoned mine building, whatever thing that Loki refers to when they've just kind of landed and run into this shelter space. And, that scene is set up and it looks like she's going in to kiss him, but really what she's doing is going in to possess his mind, right? Our expectations are being frustrated in that moment as much as Loki's expectations are being frustrated in that moment. We're being told this is sexual tension. And yet what's striking about this whole episode is that the sexual tension or romantic tension, actually, between Loki and Sylvie is in fact not erotic. It's something else.
Yeah. I'm on the fence about that.
I would say that it's amorous.
They're definitely flirting. They definitely spend much of the episode flirting. And what they always say about masturbation is it's sex with someone you love. So I think it's in bounds here.
You're totally right. I mean, it's entirely in bounds, but I do think that one of the things this episode is doing that is worth paying attention to is that by pushing the erotic to the side at the very least, it's asking us to think about things that maybe are a little more fundamental to romance. For example, in that moment where she's trying to take over his mind and he thinks she might be coming in for a kiss and we assume the same thing, the end result of that moment is that we realize that this is exactly not love, right? Possession of another, assuming that their drives and needs are subsumed within your own, that whole kind of cliche, and every romantic cliche is being kind of decimated by this episode, that cliche that, when two people get together, it's two becoming one. What bullshit, right? Like what devastating and destructive bullshit that is. Right? That we are, in fact, we remain individuals. Our individual desires and needs need to be honored. The other needs to be seen in love. And when the other is not seen, when the other is not respected or understood, then what we have is patriarchy.
Yeah.
Whoever is, or we have domination of some other variety. We have violence. And the episode is trying to push away some of these more destructive and dangerous metaphors of romance that lead us down the path to love can be violent. That's okay, right?
So if I'm following, we agree that there's romantic undertones here, pretty implicit ones. Whether it's erotic is still somewhat of an open question, and we might sort of see that slightly differently. One thing in favor of it not being erotic is the line that Sylvie has about how she essentially had relationships to pass the time, which indicated that for her, erotic love, like having those relationships and presumably those sexual relationships, were not a priority or anything that she especially thought highly of. Whereas like this connection that she was having with Loki did seem a little, while also romantic, at that sort of more fundamental, maybe spiritual level. The problem is, of that framing you were talking about, Maeve, about that shot, I was struck by the way that the silhouette really highlighted their glistening lips as they came together. And it evoked the major kiss scene in Y Tu Mama Tambien, another movie about a transgressive love. And so I didn't know if that was intentional, but it fits in that date range of stuff that Kate Herron loves to draw from. So it made me think that the show is meant to confound us a little on this question, perhaps.
Well, and it's funny, though, because it uses all of the standard romantic... What's the thing about all this is that's all in a standard romantic comedy, though. The whole point of a standard romantic comedy, going back to Shakespeare, to the trashy ones that we don't watch now that have actresses I couldn't tell you. But they all follow the same formula, which is the couple goes through many permutations of not love, of not idealized love. They fight, they have dominance games, they try to relate to each other in ways that are inappropriate, and only at the end do they realize that actually what they need to do is love each other, and that's the happy ending of a romantic comedy. And so there's ways to look at this where it's transgressive or subversive, and then there's ways to say, actually, these are kind of the stations of the romantic comedy.
Interesting.
Except for the fact that the episode ends with this totally fascinating song playing over those end credits. It's a song, Dark Moon, that Gail Storm sang. It's from 1957. It's kind of fascinating because not only is Gail Storm an interesting figure, singer, actress in the 50s and 60s, but the song itself, which is it's a country song, right? But it's got a female singer and a female guitarist playing the song. And the lyrics are both kind of obviously connected to this theme, but also striking in the way that they're presented to us. So the chorus of the song is, mortals have dreams of love's perfect schemes, but they don't realize that love will sometimes bring a dark moon away up, high up in the sky.
So does that help us with the romantic erotic case, or romantic non-erotic case, or non-romantic case? Where do you think those lyrics take us?
Well, I think that they force us to reckon with our conception of, or rather our desire for all of those metaphors of love, those conventions of love, those tropes of love to be realized in our own lives, right? Mortals have dreams of love's perfect schemes. Of course we do. You know, we're taught that Cinderella's fairy tale is an awesome way for women to end their lives. It turns out, actually, we might have some more ambitions of our own. And what does it mean to then confront masculinity or other kinds of femininity or whatever in the world, and realize that our dreams aren't served by the conventional understanding of love? As, you know, for example, speaking as a woman, the thing that I find really striking about those lyrics, though, is that what comes next, they don't realize that love will sometimes, and if you listen to the song, it sounds like she's saying break, not bring. And this is one of those things in poetry that's wonderful, right? Poetry is about sound. It's not just about words. It's not just about lyrics. It's about sound. And so we expect love will sometimes break your heart, for example. And it would still work kind of with the scheme, the rhyme scheme and the rhythm of the text. But she says, bring a dark moon, right? So we have this like non sequitur at the end of that line.
It ties into the conversation where they talk about how neither of them has found anything close to true love, right? They've had dalliances, but real. Again, I think the implication there, though, is that they might find it with each other. And it is the dark moon. It is the thing that you would never expect. You don't expect to fall in love with a time variant of yourself. And I think there are all sorts of plot implications here, because we don't quite know exactly what Sylvie's plan is. But what we do know is that this show is asking us to question whether there only has to be one version of any one person. And a good way to raise the stakes there is to have a love affair that would be decimated if they got rid of all the variants.
That's a good point.
And we do know a couple of things. One, that Loki's attraction to Sylvie, I think, begins in the moment that he realizes and says to her, "You're so weird," which is just such a brilliantly written line, right? Like, it's like that in the moment of like running away to this like bunker that they're going to, try to save themselves inside of initially, he yells to her, "You're so weird." But that's a really wonderful moment, right? It's the idea that, we're not just looking to masturbate all the time. We're not just looking to love ourselves. We're looking to love others, people who bring difference into our lives, bring variation, right? That she is a variant of him, but she is a variant of him. Yeah. And we do know at least one thing about her mission, which is to beat fascism.
Right.
right? She says this, that, you know, the time variance authority is a bunch of fascists that have been chasing variants and doing one of two things to them. Either kind of doing a version of what Sylvie does, but a long-term version of that, which is to take over the mind of another for your own benefit, for your own purpose, or destroying everyone, right?
Yeah, neither are good.
Nope, neither are good.
I want to like throw out this notion about love, though. I think that what's interesting about love is that it is usually what causes it to happen is something you have in common with somebody. You fall in love with somebody on a first date, you know, Dog and Duck 2006.
Yeah.
We're talking about what we have in common. We like Manchester music. We like all sorts of things. But that very specifically was important. You love your family members because you share blood with them. You love your friends because you had a common interest almost always that brought you together. But what they give to you in your life is that difference a lot of the time.
Yeah.
They challenge you. They help you grow. You know, otherwise, it just would be masturbation or the emotional version of it. So I think that we are getting a very heated example of this with them kind of falling in love with each other, or at least looking like it, which is like what initially charms them about each other is that they have so much in common. But in the end, I think it's going to be their differences that really create this relationship.
Or what initially draws them to each other is that they think they can instrumentalize one another.
Yes.
Right. So Loki's like, I thought we could work together. In that amazing moment where they're, you know, in front of the elevator before they have to escape out to Lamentis. And it's obvious he has no clue what it means to work together with somebody. He has no clue. Right? Because his whole idea is that she's going to serve his mission. And the same goes for her. Right? I mean, this is the one way that they're very similar with respect to one another. But what's kind of hilarious about this is that they both have to learn that that very idea of connecting with another human being is the wrong way of thinking about it. We can't simply subsume somebody else's personality and wills and drive and desire into our own, because then we lose the integrity of the other. We lose the integrity of the being that we felt we might fall in love with, or we have fallen in love with, which of course is a major crisis that writers have been interested in, that philosophers have been interested in, that psychoanalysts have been interested in. You know, like what happens when we think that we can subsume the will and desire of another into our own and call it romance.
Well, I think we're going to unpack more about this question across all the shows this week, just because there is so much evidence on both sides. There are so many questions about how we feel about it, which way we want it to go, which way it should go, which way it will go, and again, all those implications. So I look forward to teasing that out further. But on this theme, Maeve, about love and what it means and defining it and maybe refining it, what did you think of as sort of a primary work of literature or film that you feel is closely related to this idea?
One of my favorite books of all time. I've always tried to figure out ways to connect this to things that we've talked about, and it just has never made any sense. But one of the best romantic comedies ever written is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, which is a novel that is notoriously misread, right? The beginning of the novel is a truth universally acknowledged that a man in possession of a fortune is in want of a wife, or something along those lines. That's satire from Jane Austen.
Yeah, that's Jane Austen doing what you're supposed to, which is open with a joke.
Yeah, and making fun of the world that her main characters are living in, where they are as oppressed by romantic conventions as we are in 2021, right? Like some things never change, right? So we've got these two characters, Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, who fall in love over the course of the novel. But there's a really telling moment where Elizabeth reads a letter from Mr. Darcy, where having been two people who just can't see eye to eye, but are both very smart, very capable individuals. One of them has a shit ton of money, Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth Bennet, the entire estate of her father has been entailed away to another male relative that none of them have ever met before. And that's, Austen commenting on contemporary issues. But this moment in the novel where Elizabeth Bennet gets a letter from Mr. Darcy, where he sees her as herself, as a disagreeable person, as a person who is going to disagree with him, is going to show him a different way in the world because she's unique and they have some common interests, but probably making fun of the world around them, right? But on the other hand, he sees her for who she is, and he admires her for who she is. And she falls in love with him fully and completely in that moment. And then the novel kind of devolves from there into the romance. Although it's a complicated novel because it's not just like being like, oh, great, romance is great, marriage is the only answer, right? Like that's not how the novel ends. But it does have this moment where that idea, the recognition of the other, for all of their complexity and in all their complexity, is the only pathway to love.
Well, that's a pretty compelling case. I admittedly thought of something slightly less, I suppose, classical or wonderfully taught, which was Out of Sight, the movie with Clooney and Jennifer Lopez, right? You have the cop and the criminal, and they sort of trust each other but don't, and there's all this tension, and of course they actually do hook up, but in the same sort of vein of these questions of trust and also, dysfunctionality and functionality. I don't know, that kind of popped out to me. What about you, Amanda? What jumped out to you?
The creators of the show have given some interviews where they explain that Before Sunrise was a huge inspiration on this.
I love that movie.
The whole romance on a train, self-discovery thing through it. So I wanted to put a flag in that because I think it really does signpost that this is supposed to be a romance, but it's supposed to be a romance about that's towards this kind of self-discovery narrative, not the typical rom-com propaganda for patriarchal relationships thing. But I was reminded actually of The Princess Bride.
That actually is a classic movie, so good call.
It's a great movie.
It was one of those things where The Princess Bride is one of those movies that's way more clever than it seems because on its surface. And I think most people recognize that because they've watched it over and over and over again. Yeah. It's a movie that somehow satirizes romantic narratives while ultimately still, just like Pride and Prejudice, upholding the idea that romantic narratives still have a lot of value, because I don't think any of us think that the love at the center of the story is anything but endearing, right?
Yeah.
But it's also a story about how love is about self-discovery, right? It's about the Dread Pirate Roberts becomes the Dread Pirate Roberts because he loves Buttercup and he wants to have her back. So he finds who he is through this kind of process of rescuing this woman. And I think vice versa, she also finds strength inside herself that she didn't necessarily know that she had. And I think that's why the story is somehow both a commentary, a satire of romantic narratives, while also kind of telling a truer story of that. And I think that's obviously an inspiration and an influence on this, because we're looking at kind of a similar use of the tropes of romantic comedies to tell us deeper story about becoming who you are.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful comparison. Also because both this and Princess Bride subvert the conventions of fairy tale, which often have two characters who are on separate paths that are not productive for either of them. Mm-hmm. And then let me take something like Cinderella, where the prince essentially gives to Cinderella a purpose in life. And in both cases of Princess Bride and this episode, we have characters that are giving one another purpose and recognizing that there are divergent selves in that union, that the union isn't about subsuming identity. So at the very end of this episode, we have Sylvie walk off in disappointment and frustration. And Loki's expression of disappointment is a distinct one. Though they're united in their purpose, they have divergent selves and ways of living in the world and being. And whether or not love is going to come from this, I don't know. We don't know. But what we do know is that they've seen each other for their whole distinct variant selves.
I will also add that literally when she said love is hate, all I could think of was the scene in Princess Bride where he's like, wove, twoo wove.
Twoo wove.
Oh, wow.
Marriage.
I had one other movie thought, which was a little unsettling. If you haven't seen the movie Crimson Peak and you think you're going to, jump ahead a minute or two. It is a little odd, right? That this is the second Tom Hiddleston project about potentially having sex with your sister that also involves mining. So in the movie Crimson Peak, Tom Hiddleston and Jessica Chastain play brother and sister. There's a woman that Tom Hiddleston's character marries, but it's just a way to get her money for the family. And unquestionably, this was like a straight up incest movie between Hiddleston and Chastain. It was a disturbing horror movie. It's pretty fun. If you like that kind of thing, it's just odd that it was also about mining. He's designing mining equipment, and his family lives on a mine. This moon that they're on is a mining moon. And there was just a lot of connections between those things that kind of weirded me out, Amanda. Did you have any thoughts about that?
Well, it's not incest. I mean, I think this is going to be debated on Reddit into infinity. Are they brother and sister? I think for it to be incest, they have to be a separate person who is related to you, whereas Sylvie is another Loki. They're both Lokis, and so I just don't think it applies here. Like, that's why I've been making masturbation jokes, not incest jokes. I'll also add that typically incest is almost exclusively used in film and literature as a symbol of corruption. You know, you think of Game of Thrones, and the Jaime-Cersei relationship is probably the most famous example. It is there to instill the sense of the corruption of the Lannisters, and as is, you know, the way that all the Valerians did it as well. They were corrupt people.
Yeah, everything about the lineage of a lot of those families, anytime incest was brought up, that's such a great point, that it's about that symbol of corruption. Whereas one of the amazing things about this episode is, however you feel, if you have weirdness about this, the episode, you can feel its casual lack of judgment. Like, it is not judging this relationship. Everything about it is really void of that feel. And I'm not exactly sure how Kate Herron pulled that off in totality, but I really feel like she did. So maybe that makes some folks uncomfortable, but for me, I am certainly clear that the episode, the show itself, is utterly non-judgmental about whichever version of love is developing between them, whatever it is. It's not about judging that.
I would recommend her Netflix show Sex Education, which is also also very pro-masturbation.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that this show shares in common with that show is the prioritization of these meditative moments where characters sit down and just chat with one another.
Yeah.
Right? Like, one of the things that's kind of striking formally about this episode is that we have high action scenes intercut with scenes where there's almost no non-diegetic sound. Right? So diegetic sound and non-diegetic sound are distinct because there's sound that belongs in the universe of the scene, like the sound in the bar of like people serving drinks and coming over and saying hi and blah, blah, blah. Right? And then there's non-diegetic sound, which is the sound of soundtrack over something. In all of those scenes where they are talking to one another, there's almost no non-diegetic sound. We're not being influenced in any way by soundtrack. In fact, we're being told, pay attention to the words and pay attention to the interaction between these two characters. And it's so sharply marked from the conventional scenes of a superhero show, where you've got all this action and so much noise and so much influential soundtrack. And so I think she's really calling attention to these moments where we're supposed to listen and think about what these characters are saying to one another, what it means that they might be falling in love, that they might have a connection that is more than something we can just put a label on, the way that soundtrack does. Soundtrack puts labels on things. We know when a horror scene is happening. We know when a romantic scene is happening. It puts labels on things. This doesn't put a label on those moments when they are talking about love or are doing something that implies to us that there is romance happening here.
Well, that feels like a powerful note to leave this theme discussion on. I suspect we're just getting started on their relationship and where it's going. And certainly on the Marvelous TV Club this week, like I said, we're going to keep talking about this and expanding on this conversation. So if you're not done thinking about it, don't worry, neither are we. But Amanda, let's talk about what you saw. What did you see as the main theme driving this episode?
To quote Helmuth Karl Bernhard von Moltke,
My favorite guy. Yeah.
he's a 19th century Prussian field marshal. No plan survives first contact with the enemy.
I've heard that, but I did not. Thank you for clarifying who told us that. Okay, no plan survives first contact with the enemy.
10 names. Yep.
Or, if you prefer, the Scottish poet Robert Burns, the best laid schemes of mice and men, gang after gley. Which, if you translate it from Scots, means the best laid plans of mice and men rarely go as planned. And I think that watching this episode, if you've ever played a role-playing game, D&D or any others, you really recognize the situation at hand, which is you've made this cool plan, you've spent an hour like hashing out the details with your team, and literally as soon as you start doing it, everything goes sideways, and next thing you know, you're fighting everyone in the bar. I think that was the theme that really sprung out to me in this episode. It was really very obsessed with the idea that planning often fails us, and instead you have to be able to sort of react pretty effectively in the moment.
It feels like you have a number of scenes to choose from for this, because I'm picking up what you're putting down, but was there one key scene or thread that you thought stood out, especially for this idea?
I think that the one that really struck me as the most telling was when they went to the bar, or they went on the train, and they had this elaborate plan to take the train to the Ark, to use the Ark as a battery for this temp pad. And as soon as they get to the train, Loki just gets drunk and everything just goes tits up.
I don't know. I mean,
it really does,
I was having a good time. Was it bad? Because I was having fun.
I mean, that's always the best part of a D&D game, is when everything goes tits up.
100%.
Well, there was actually one time when one of Maeve's characters took like a rage dump in our enemy's like headquarters, and it was super memorable. But you're right, Amanda, we did not
Real effective.
plan for that.
No, did not plan for that.
The stuff you can't plan for is both the funniest,
Yeah, exactly.
the funnest, and maybe the most effective, guys. Come on.
Yeah, but it almost gets them killed multiple times in this episode, really challenging Loki's theory that chaos equals fun.
Well, what's interesting, though, is they do work well together improvisationally, but it takes them a while to find that balance where they're each relying on each other's strengths to get things done. So what other scenes did you see, Amanda, that tied into this problem of planning and when plans go wrong?
I mean, like you said, it's most of the episode. It started early, like Sylvie going into it with Loki about how she'd been planning for years to do this, and he screwed it up. Even when she breaks into the TVA, like the first guy she fights, her entire strategy just goes sideways, and she has to change her plans. The plan of the Ark itself to leave Lamentis is disrupted when they're hit by a meteor. The temp pad, I would say, is actually a symbol of all of this throughout the episode. It just never works. It never works how it's supposed to. I think most interestingly, though, the dialogue, as Maeve said earlier, like the dialogue is so important in this series, and every word is so carefully chosen. And back and forth through the whole episode, Sylvie and Loki are arguing with each other constantly about whose plans suck more.
I love that moment where they're walking up to the train and you know, she's like, "What do you think?" with this like, you know, costume on. She like, it looks like a shit plan. Yeah. It's so good. It's such a good moment.
What's funny is they're both right. Like, and we see this in the scene where they go try to deal with this old woman, and Sylvie's plan just doesn't work. And Loki's like, "Oh, I can do it." And his plan doesn't work either, because no one's plans work.
Well, no one's plans work, certainly especially when they're like not taking advantage of each other's resources. But even then, I'm still not sure that plans hold up. I don't know. Does a single plan even work in this entire episode?
It's not to say that they're ineffective either. They're both effective if under two conditions: when they're reacting and with each other, when they have each other's back. And I think that there is actually something more interesting that the episode's trying to say there that really goes back to Maeve's theme about love. And it's a little bit more about The problem with Loki as a character from the beginning, and his main flaw as a character, I think in a lot of ways, is that he sees himself as separate from his family, from his community, that he's a loner, Dottie, a rebel. And one of the reasons that he's a schemer is because he thinks of himself as this sort of sole individual who has no reliance on anybody else. But what we're seeing in this episode is that that's actually not true, because schemes always end up failing with first contact with the enemy. And instead, his strength is relying on this woman, and she being another Loki relying on him.
Yeah. It's funny, too, because Tom Hiddleston plays that up to such perfect comic effect, right? When they're trying to get into the train and he's like, I am taking her to Charu. And then they get inside and he's like, good evening, passengers. Hi. It's just perfect. This is Tom Hiddleston at his best, I think, in some ways, where he's just delivers these faux wooden lines. This is a talented actor pretending to be a shit actor. And he's so good at it.
It actually is like one of those things that is one of the best jokes in the entire Thor and Loki saga, which is the get help joke in Ragnarok.
Oh, yeah.
Like the whole point of that bit is that Loki hates it when he has to like play act an injured guy in order to set somebody up for Thor to kick their ass. But it works. It works every time, does it not?
Well, it works temporarily in this context, right? And I think that's really crucial because we have them trying to play something out, and yet their own personalities come out inevitably. He drinks his and her champagne, then gets tanked. He's like, we relax, differently, get to know me. It's cool. Right. So the problem is that putting on a persona only works temporarily. If you're just trying to play out a plan, those rules of engagement, right, they just fall apart eventually. Right. We see that the same thing in that moment where he encounters the old woman, where they both encounter the old woman, and they're debating whether or not force or diplomacy and or guile are going to work. None of it works, because if you can't think on your feet, you're going to fall apart. Once the whole thing starts to play out, it's going to fall apart.
The one plan that's kind of successful is getting on the train, and that's because they work really well together, where it's actually not going to work because Loki's disguise didn't incorporate the paperwork that a bureaucratic society would obviously need. But she steps in and uses her powers. And so again, the marriage of the two is what causes,
as it were.
And I don't know that this is necessarily, like you said, romantic love indicating it, because this was also a theme in the Thor movies, or at least Ragnarok, which was Loki and Thor are stronger together.
Yeah.
We've seen this threaded throughout the entire Loki catalog. Mobius's plan to use Loki completely backfires on Mobius, obviously, in this show. All of Loki's plans to get over on Thor throughout the Thor movies have always backfired on Loki. Odin's plans to raise Loki and make everything better through this hostage kid that he's going to hide as an adopted kid and not even tell him he's a freaking frost giant, that all colossally blows up in his face. But Amanda, I can think of one scene where one person has their own little agenda and pulls it off, and it's actually right at the beginning of this episode, which is that Sylvie's plan to get inside the head of C20 totally works. How do you account for that?
I was really struck by the way that she was talking to C20 about the brain freeze thing, and she tells her this weird line about how the brain freeze freezes your memories in place.
Yeah.
And I thought about what that could possibly mean and realized freezing memories or moments in time in place is exactly what the timekeepers are trying to do. They are trying to hold the timeline into one single line. And that is what Sylvie's trying to disrupt. And what is the timeline if not a plan? What is...
Oh, sure.
That it's all the same kind of thing, right? A plan, a timeline, all these things. The very notion that we can kind of keep everything neat, clean, and orderly is this like fantasy that just gets disrupted always. And I think that we're seeing Loki and Sylvie's plans get frustrated time and again. and they're trying to frustrate the timekeeper's plans. And we are kind of we're halfway through a deep meditation about the impossibility of keeping chaos at bay.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, and maybe also that teleology is fascism. That some predicted conception of where the world is supposed to go historically or whatever, right? Our conception of progress, for example, that there is something fascistic about a preconception of what that is supposed to look like and how people are supposed to play their roles inside of it.
So even a scene where technically someone's plan works is really just a commentary on plans not working. But let's talk about works of literature or film that you feel are related to this theme of the best laid plans blowing up in your face. Amanda, what do you think of first when you think of this theme, and what might have influenced this episode?
Well, I've already mentioned one Coen Brothers movie in the Loki series of Storycast, No Country for Old Men. I think it's not surprising that another Coen Brothers movie came to mind, because I think that they are probably the best filmmakers on the theme of chaos. But the one that I keep thinking of is Raising Arizona, especially when it comes to both plans and also these larger meditations on time and the future. So anyone who's not seen Raising Arizona, just as soon as you're over with this podcast, put it on. It's one of the greatest movies of all time. And it is about a ridiculous plan that, of course, as in every other Coen Brothers movie, just goes up in a puff of smoke, ends up in comic chaos. And some of them are tragic chaos. This one's comic chaos. And it's like, he's got this wife that's infertile. He wants to steal a baby so she can have a baby because they can't adopt. And then it gets crazier and crazier and crazier as Nicolas Cage's character tries to stay one step ahead of the people trying to get this baby back. He eventually has to give the baby back. It's not his baby. But the ending, the movie is hilarious. It's a silly comedy about the best laid plans. But then at the end, there's this amazing meditation because he and his wife can't have children. That's the whole premise of the movie. But then he has this dream at the end where he and his wife actually end up having this large family. And he wakes up and he says it's something about it being true and it was real. And you are, as the viewer, left to believe that this is actually going to be their future or not. But either way, the point of it is that we are not actually necessarily bound, that the very chaos that kept him from being able to steal this baby effectively, the chaos of the worlds might actually be the very thing that allows him and his wife to have children as they always wanted to, that they may not actually be doomed to be infertile as the doctors have been telling them. And I think there's a lot of beauty in that. And I think that this episode is kind of touching on the same thing, which is, are we destined for one single outcome, or is there actually more chaos and therefore more opportunity for people than we like to imagine?
Yeah. Is there more than one pathway to family? Is there more than one pathway to love? Is there more than one pathway to anything? Right? There have to be more than one pathways to these things, because it's a ridiculous proposition given the variety of the history of the world that we have lived in and seen, to think that there is only one way to do any of these things.
Well, and going back to your theme, I think one of the things about Raising Arizona that's makes it such a deep movie, despite the silliness of it, is that it basically argues that while scheming and plans and laying plans never works, things always kind of are more chaotic than you could ever predict. One thing that you can be sure of is love.
Yeah.
He and his wife break up at the end of the movie, but again, it's implied that they will get back together because they do love each other. And there's a certainty in each other that we can't have in the environment around us.
Yeah.
What other kinds of works might tie into this idea?
Well, any other Coen Brothers movie.
Well, that's fair.
Also, any other heist movie. I think heist movies.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
My favorite.
No heist movie is good if the plan just goes exactly as it was planned. The movie gets interesting when things go sideways, right?
But that's the best thing about the form of a heist movie or the form of a caper film, right? Which is that they tell you the story in advance, right? They tell you the plan in advance, and then they basically show you how it almost every heist movie, every caper film does this, right? Where they're like, and first we're going to do this, and then we're going to do that, and then we're going to do this, and then it's going to resolve perfectly. And they play it out, right? So while somebody is doing a narration of this, we watch it happen. And then all we watch in the next set of scenes is how it goes awry.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. Band of Outsiders is the perfect example of this.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Yeah, I mean, Band of Outsiders is one of the best heist films ever made. Jean-Luc Godard, right? Yeah. So it's a set of characters who are like, young people bored, whatever. They're obsessed with criminals and crime, and they come up with this scheme to steal money, and it goes horribly, horribly, horribly wrong. And in the process, they have a ton of fun and then a ton of not fun. And then things work out in this really weird pat way. So like this is Godard like really playing with the genre of the film, but it's beautiful and it's really fascinating in the ways that you're talking about, Amanda. This sort of, plans inevitably are going to go awry. But I'm just gonna spoil. So if you want to like fast forward slightly, love is the response.
Aw, it all ties together
right?
again.
It's going to be fine, which may be a little bit ironic in the context of a film that's like super self-conscious about this, but yeah.
Well, in Avengers Endgame, they refer to their plan to get those Infinity Stones back before Thanos gets his hands on them as a time heist. And that is literally how this Loki goes variant, right? The Avengers plan immediately blows up in their face. Hulk smashes through that door after climbing those stairs. The cosmic cube goes flying, and this Loki takes it. Then they got to go to a whole other time to try to get the cosmic cube from the 70s, and it's a whole thing. So, yeah, that's a totally great point that the heist movie, in essence, is about the plan going awry.
And I will point out literally almost every time travel story is this as well, which is the whole point of a time travel story is time travelers go back in time in order to do X, Y, or Z, and then they fuck it up terribly. And then the rest of the story is about trying to fix it, not fix it, et cetera, et cetera. Like, I mean, Back to the Future obviously has this huge impact on this particular show, and the entire the bulk of the movie is about Marty and Doc's elaborate plan to get his parents back together and get him back to the future, right? And they pull some of it off, but they almost don't. But they screw it up in just one of the most profound ways because their plan is way too elaborate. And they're a little bit worried, I think, about it not going the way it was supposed to. But in the end, it ends up working out because his parents are more in love and his family is more solid than it was when he left. And I think that it's, again, kind of meditating on the sort of same theme of like how these kind of chaotic moments that often can spin us are also opportunities and can also, reinforce our relationships to each other.
Yeah. Like reorient us as we're spinning out of control. We're reoriented by the people who are committed to helping us get through it.
Yeah. Back to the Future, another movie where, there's a little bit of a transgressive relationship there. Lorraine's hitting on Marty. Lorraine is his mom. Marty's Calvin Klein. She's kind of into him. Again, I endorse a Loki Sylvie setup. I just think it's interesting that you're 100%. Right, Amanda. Like, every time travel movie goes bad, and they obviously keep referring to 1985 in this, that's, a Back to the Future thing for sure. And, a lot of people had a lot of thoughts about that whole Lorraine Marty scene when he's in his skivvies. Well, these are two incredible themes, and I really appreciate how much you both linked them together. This idea of like defining love and pushing back against the single sort of narrative of how it works and creating the space for that, which, right, that single narrative is in and of itself a kind of plan that is laid out for you how things are supposed to go, and defining that or redefining that or blowing up that plan, might be essential to really finding out what it means to love. Meanwhile, of course, no plan survives first contact with the enemy, as Amanda quoted, I believe it was Helmuth Karl Bernhard von Moltke. So file that away, folks. But yeah, so no plan, all plans go awry, and we've seen that in this episode over and over and over again. And a lot of the stories that involve that also happen to involve a little thing called love.
Oh.
All right, Amanda, if folks want to keep talking to you about your opinion of whether Loki and Sylvie should be together, where can they find and follow you?
They can find me on Twitter at Amanda Marcotte. I would say don't tweet at me, but it's okay if you go back in time and tweet at me.
Back when you actually read your mentions? Find 2011 Amanda. She was still reading them then, I promise.
And I'm also at salon.com, where we definitely read every comment. So definitely show up and comment there.
So Maeve, if someone wants to talk to you about the definition of love, where can they find and follow you?
I'm on Twitter at Maeve Adams, Maeve Adams. You can definitely tweet at me and I'm going to read it. So yeah, do it. And you can find things I write academically at academia.edu.
Yeah, not too many of us have quite as many followers as Amanda and her. What are we at? 86,000?
Oh, I don't know. Something like that.
Just a few.
Just a handful. See, that's good
Just
takes, folks. All right, Audio Avengers, that is our show for today. We have a ton more Loki to discuss on Pondervision and Character Cast. Definitely going to keep talking about this relationship/not relationship. So keep your ears open for those on Saturday and Monday. And then we will be here to break down the next episode of Loki right before 4th of July weekend on Thursday with more Storycast. If you are enjoying this show, you know what I'm going to ask for: a 5-star Apple review. That really helps us rise in those search rankings and makes a difference for discovery. So please leave us one of those if you can. If you want to talk to me, you can find me on any of our platforms: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. All of those are at Marvelous TV Club. I'm on Twitter at Marc Faletti. That's Mark with a C, F like Frank, Aletti. All right, team, let's hop on that escape vessel. What's the worst that could happen? Ah!